All right, today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to crack open a century-old engineering case file. This is a story about a truly brilliant graphical solution to a huge industrial problem, and it was invented decades before anyone even dreamed of a computer. So yeah, let's dive into this thermodynamic detective story.
So picture this. It's 1921. The world is industrializing at this breakneck speed, right? And the engine driving all of this is chemical manufacturing. But here's the catch. That engine runs on steam, and steam costs an absolute fortune. I mean, every single drop of wasted energy was money just disappearing. The pressure was on big time to design smarter, not just bigger. And that right there, that's the central mystery. How in the world did they figure out the perfect size for these massive, towering distillation columns with basically nothing more than a slide rule and a piece of paper? The old ways of doing it, they were just brutally tedious and, honestly, often wrong. Something new, a totally new way of thinking, was desperately needed.
Okay, so that brings us to our first chapter here, a problem in the air. And you gotta understand, this wasn't just some academic puzzle for people in ivory towers. No, this was a real-world challenge that every single engineer in the industry was banging their head against. A solution was out there, just waiting to be discovered.
You know, the idea of distillation itself is ancient. We're talking all the way back to the alchemists. But designing it scientifically? That was a whole different and really frustrating ballgame. By the late 1800s, this French engineer Sorel, he laid the mathematical groundwork. But his method? Oh man, it involved these painstaking, stage-by-stage calculations that were an absolute nightmare to do by hand. The 1920s? They just demanded something better, something faster, something more elegant.
So why the big rush? What was driving this urgency? Well, it really boils down to three huge forces. First, you've got the car boom. Everyone wanted one, which meant an insatiable demand for gasoline. Second, industry needed massive amounts of high-purity alcohol, for solvents and chemical feedstocks. And the big one, the thing underpinning it all, was the absolutely crushing cost of energy. Efficiency wasn't just a nice-to-have anymore, it was a flat-out necessity for survival.
Okay, and this is where our first protagonist kind of enters the scene. And I say kind of because enters might be too strong a word. He's more like a ghost in the machine, just a name attached to this brilliant idea, but the man himself is almost completely lost to history. So for now, let's just call him the invisible theorist. So the big question, who was Marcel Ponchon? And the honest answer is, we really don't know. Seriously. There are no detailed biographies, no academic records we can dig up, not even a clear career path. The guy is a complete enigma, a man who is defined entirely by the one single, groundbreaking piece of work he left behind.
And this is it. This is his entire legacy, a two-part paper published in 1921. But what's really revealing is where he published it. He chose a journal called La Technique Moderne. Now, this wasn't some stuffy academic journal. It was a magazine for practicing engineers out in the field. See, Ponchon wasn't writing for history books. He was delivering a practical, usable tool directly to the people who needed it the most, right then and there.
All right, so that's Ponchon. Now for the second name on our method, Savarit. And if Ponchon was our invisible theorist, Savarit was the industrial innovator. He was the guy who took this powerful idea and anchored it in the real world of patents, in factories, and production lines.
So how do we know this? Well, our key clue comes from this U.S. patent, filed about a decade later. And this is what connects the dots. It links the mysterious R. Savarit from those original papers to a real person, Paul Savarit, an inventor from Melle, France, who was working on the very practical problem of manufacturing absolute alcohol. Suddenly, our detective story has a solid lead.
And this just perfectly illustrates what this guy was all about. In his own words from the patent, you can see he's an engineer who is just obsessed with solving tangible economic problems. He wasn't just noodling on theories. No, he was actively chasing cost savings and process improvements. He was the guy who was making theory profitable.
So what was this big breakthrough they shared? It all comes down to this, the enthalpy-concentration diagram. The best way to think about it is like a complete thermodynamic map of a chemical mixture. You've got the energy content, that's enthalpy, on one axis and its composition on the other. And boom, you have basically everything you need to know on a single visual chart. And by using this map, their method becomes this amazing visual journey. You just plot your start and end points, right? Then you establish these geometric anchor points based on the energy flowing in and out of the system. And then you just step your way from one end to the other, literally drawing lines and counting the stages as you go.
It took a really complex algebraic slog and turned it into this elegant, almost beautiful geometric puzzle.
But just as this really rigorous method was starting to catch on, a rival appeared on the scene. And this new challenger offered something that is always incredibly seductive to an engineer: simplicity. And this right here, set up a fundamental trade-off that engineers are still grappling with to this day.
So, in 1925, a couple of American engineers, McCabe and Thiele, they introduced their own graphical method, and it was built on one incredibly clever shortcut. They just assumed that for every bit of vapor that condenses on a tray, the exact same amount of liquid boils off. This assumption, which we call Constant Molar Overflow, or CMO, well, it changed everything.
So now you've got this classic engineering trade-off. On one hand, you have Ponchon-Savarit. It's the rigorous one. It uses a complete energy and mass balance. It's super accurate, but man, it needs a ton of enthalpy data that can be really hard to find. On the other hand, you have McCabe-Thiele. It only needs basic equilibrium data. It's wonderfully simple, but you always have to remember it's an approximation. If that core CMO assumption doesn't hold up for your system, your answer is going to be wrong. Simple as that.
So that's the core trade-off right there. Do you need the rigorous, data-intensive tool that you know is always going to be accurate? Or is the elegant, simple shortcut good enough for the problem you're trying to solve? For 100 years now, engineers have had to ask themselves that very question.
Which, of course, brings us to today. I mean, in a world full of supercomputers and incredibly sophisticated software, what possible relevance could a 100-year-old method that's all about drawing lines on a piece of paper have?
Okay, so I'm going to make a bold statement here. As a practical design tool that you actually do by hand, the graphical method is obsolete. Full stop. Nobody, and I mean nobody, is designing a billion-dollar refinery with a pencil and a ruler anymore. But, and this is the critical takeaway of this whole story, the thinking behind it is more important now than it has ever been. The procedure itself might be obsolete, sure, but the principles, they are absolutely timeless.
So why is that? Well, for one, the very same principles of mass and energy balance are literally coded into the DNA of every modern process simulator we use today. But even more importantly, learning this method forces you to see the physics. It builds an intuition, a real gut feeling for how the process actually works. And that's the skill that lets an engineer look at a computer's output and say, hang on a second, something about this just doesn't feel right. And really, that leaves us with a final, pretty deep question. In an age where our tools are getting more and more powerful, more automated, where they're basically becoming black boxes, what is the true value of that deep-seated human intuition? If the legacy of Ponchon and Savarit tells us anything, it's that intuition might just be the most valuable tool we've got.